Hello lovely people, my name is Emma. Today we are doing another 360 book review where I talk about a book for 360 seconds or less and try and give you a full 360 look at what the book entails. Today we're going to be talking about All the Living and the Dead by Hayley Campbell. This is a non-fiction book that is looking at people who work in various different death industries or industries that involve interacting with dead bodies or the dying in various different ways. Hayley Campbell does not actually work in any of these industries herself, but instead is a journalist who is going around and kind of interviewing slash chatting and kind of seeing behind the scenes look of 12 different people in different aspects of the industry. This is definitely a book that is for people who are fans of like Caitlin Doughty's like The Smoke That Gets in Your Eyes or From Here to Eternity, or for people who are like interested in medical stuff in general as well. And it is basically trying to pull back the curtain and have a look at what it means to interact with the dead and dead bodies, and sort of the taboo that we as a society tend to wrap around these things. This book was beautiful, basically. I know that possibly is like a weird thing to say about a book about death, but it really was incredibly poignant and incredibly lovely as a way of sort of seeing how people interact with death in different ways. So some of the people who we get to meet include like a funeral director, somebody who works with medical cadavers and makes them ready for being donated to medicine and to science. You've got somebody who works in a crematorium, you've got like a death mask maker, an executioner, a bereavement midwife, a grave digger, and somebody who works in like cryonics, which is what people often call cryogenics, which is not actually the accurate term. If you're talking about like trying to suspend your body in some form of like state of animation ready to be like woken up later down the line, that is actually cryonics instead of cryogenics. So you learn something through all of these different books. There were some really lovely distinctions that were made in this book about the idea of quite often people's interactions with death are when they have lost a loved one and they have not necessarily seen death or a dead body before then. And it was in one of the very early chapters where Hayley was talking with a funeral director who was saying, actually, we should all be exposed to a dead body in some way, shape or form before it is a loved one, just so that you can separate out the shock of seeing death from the shock of grief. And it was sort of a distinction that I'd never really thought about before and was definitely incredibly interesting. And like the book has loads of little snippets like that where it's making distinctions between the passing of a person who you don't know and the passing of someone who you do know, and the way that emotions are very different in those different areas. Hayley has a lovely writing style, it has a real nice flow to it, and it's actually quite a short book. It clocks in at like under 250 pages, so it's definitely quite a fast read, and is one I would recommend even if you're like not necessarily super into non-fiction. It could be a good place to start, which again, I know a bit of a weird suggestion, but death is everywhere and death will come for everyone, including those cryonics people at the end, presumably, eventually at some point, and was, yeah, really, really interesting. There are a couple of chapters that definitely gave me a bit more of the ick than others, but I think that's kind of the point to a book like this. Like, I found the executioner one and the cryonics ones in particular very difficult to read, and I also didn't enjoy the embalming section because I don't particularly agree with embalming in general. But the point to a book like this is to explore those areas where you find a natural sort of ick pulling back, kind of it's hitting some sort of nerve and some underlying intuition that you have, because those lines are different for everybody. One thing I do wish that this book had made a bit more of a distinction of was those who work with the dead and those who work with the dying. It's something which I have had more experience of in recent years, having had a change of careers and now working in veterinary medicine, and I do hasten to add that this book is entirely about human death. There is a vague reference to a few pet things at the very end, but it's predominantly about people from our own species, whereas I obviously work with animals who are not of our species, and that is going to add a completely different element to how you're interacting with death. But I see death on an incredibly regular basis in my workplace, because in veterinary medicine we have access to humane euthanasia, which is something that is done probably far more regularly than you would necessarily realise if you're not part of the industry. Especially, I work in a very large 24-hour hospital, so we see a lot of very intense stuff and a lot of trauma in many different ways, and the outcomes of not an insignificant number of those are euthanasia, and this can be in a way that is beautiful and lovely and sort of a gift that we can give a pet at the very end of what has been a lovely life, or can be an incredibly traumatic experience due to something like a road traffic accident. And those can be happening on the same day, and you have very different emotional responses to both of them. And I think this book would have been really interesting to explore that distinction, because actually for a lot of the people, they are working with the dead body rather than seeing that moment of passing, whereas somebody like the executioner and the bereavement midwife in particular are working in an environment where you are literally on the cusp of that transition from alive to dead. And I think that is something which adds a different kind of trauma to what is being experienced, and there's just, I think this book had room to explore that in a bit more detail. That is my only minor gripe about this book. Other than that, I think it is beautiful and it is incredibly tastefully done. Hayley treats all of these areas with a lot of reverence and respect, and you can really see that the professionals in these different industries really respect that of her and kind of let her into a world, and it's a real pull back behind the curtains. And you do get a lot of dark humour, a lot of sort of levity in a book like this, which again I think was really lovely to see, because it's definitely something that like I experience a lot in my industry. A lot of us have quite bleak, dark sense of humour, and it becomes very much a coping mechanism for the kind of stuff that you're exposed to all the time. So it was interesting to see that and to kind of have that open, because I think that's something that, again, people who aren't necessarily exposed to these kind of emotions don't realise how much you need that in place to kind of protect yourself. So yeah, that's kind of it from me. It is a wonderful, beautiful book about death, dead and the dying. And yeah, what more can I really say? So feel free to check it out, and I am going to be putting out a video at some point fairly soon, or it might even be out already, about other books about death, including like Caitlin Doughty's ones that I've mentioned, but I've read a few other things in this area as well, so I'm going to be doing a whole video about it in particular. But I really wanted to zoom in on this book that I read recently because it was bloody beautiful. So have a wonderful reading week. Let me know in the comments down below, have you read it? What did you think to it? What do you think about death? And yeah, that's it from me. Bye.